In my last video, I shared our complete spring planting schedule, which starts in February and ends in May. Our approach to spring planting is part of a larger strategy to extend the growing season, increase yields, and provide a continuous harvest from our Zone 5 garden. Today I'll show one of the many plantings from that 4-month schedule. I'll plant 7 cold-hardy crops that can all be started weeks before your last frost date, even if you're not growing under cover like we are. There's really no easier way to extend your growing season than by growing cold-hardy crops and starting them before your last frost date. Even though we are growing under cover, I'll provide start dates for both growing under cover and growing out in the open. Let's start by taking a look at when these crops can be planted in the garden, both with and without protection. The 7 crops are beets, carrots, lettuce, parsnips, peas, radishes, and spinach. Using a variety of sources, including seed packets, the Farmer's Almanac, and the book Square Foot Gardening, let's look at when we can plant these crops without protection, relative to our last frost date, which is at the end of April. Parsnips can be started outside without protection 2 to 3 weeks before the last frost. Beets can be started 2 to 4 weeks before, carrots 3 to 5 weeks before, and peas, radishes, spinach, and lettuce 4 to 6 weeks before. So even if we weren't growing under protection, we could start some of these crops as early as mid-March. Of course, we take current weather conditions and the extended forecast into account before planting. To figure out when you can plant these crops outside in your area, just count back from your last frost date. If you don't know the date, you can easily find it online. Now let's look at when I can plant them under my low tunnel. My rule of thumb is to plant cold-hardy crops 3 to 4 weeks before the recommended date for each layer of protection used. I'll be using 1 layer, so moving the date ranges 4 weeks earlier, we see that it's safe to plant everything today, March 6th, except for maybe parsnips. But considering how unseasonably warm it is, I feel comfortable stretching the guidelines a bit and planting parsnips too. Speaking of the unseasonably warm weather, we are being more aggressive with our early plantings this year because it is so warm. If on the other hand you still have snow on the ground or your soil is frozen, you'll want to wait for the snow to melt and for the soil to thaw before planting. The soil in these beds was still partially frozen just 1 week ago, so we placed low tunnels over them to thaw out the soil so we could plant today. Now the soil is completely thawed out and ready to plant. But first I'll add a thin layer of worm castings from our indoor worm bins to the soil surface. Worm castings are rich in nutrients and contain plant growth hormones, so we always try to include some worm castings with our spring planting. Now that we're ready to plant, I'll start with one of our favorite spring crops, sugar snap peas. Hey boy. I sow 8 peas per foot, about 1 inch deep along the sides and back of the bed. We'll remove the low tunnel in early April, and at that time I'll install trellises for the peas to climb. Next I plant a variety of radishes in the rest of the bed. I follow the square foot gardening spacing of 16 per square foot, and I place the seeds about 1/2 inch below the surface. Next I'll plant beets, carrots, parsnips, spinach, and lettuce here in this bed. I plant beets about 1/2 inch deep and 3 inches apart. Carrots 1/4 inch deep and 3 inches apart. And parsnips 1/2 inch deep and 3 inches apart. If some seeds don't germinate, I'll come back later and sow more seeds. I take a slightly different approach to planting lettuce and spinach. Because they're greens and can be eaten as microgreens, I sow seeds much more closely than is recommended. We'll harvest some of the plants early as microgreens and let others grow to maturity. I plant lettuce about 1/4 inch deep and spinach about 1/2 inch deep. I then thoroughly water the 2 beds and return the covers to the low tunnels. I'll probably keep the covers on most of the time until I see the first seedlings emerge. This will keep the soil warm and help with germination. After I see seedlings though, I'll be careful to vent the low tunnels to prevent overheating. As warm as the forecast looks, I'll probably keep them vented most of the time before removing them completely in early April. And that's all the work I'm going to do in the garden today. Next weekend I'll start tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers indoors, and also start more cold-hardy crops out in the garden under cold frames. I've already set up a number of cold frames to warm up the soil in preparation for that planting. We find these small successive plantings starting in February and ending in May to be easier and more manageable than one or two very large plantings in the spring. They also provide us with an earlier harvest and a more continuous harvest through the spring and summer. And remember, even if you're not growing under cover, there are many crops you can start weeks before your last frost, including the ones I talked about today. In the upcoming weeks, I'll share even more crops that you can start before your last frost date. Well, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, remember, you can change the world 1 yard at a time.